The first time Grant Warren brought a bouquet of wild columbines into the Silver Creek saloon, every man at the bar turned to stare at him as if he had walked in wearing a dress. It was the spring of 1878, and the town of Caldera Falls, Texas sat baking under a sky so wide and blue it looked painted. The dust on Main Street was thick as flour, the horses at the hitching post stamped their hooves against the heat, and the men who populated that rough stretch of frontier earth were as hard and weathered as the mesquite wood they burned in their stoves. They wore calluses like badges and spoke in short sentences that did not waste breath. They measured a man by the straightness of his fence line, the weight of his cattle, and the steadiness of his shooting hand. Nobody had ever thought to measure a man by the softness of the flowers he kept. Grant Warren was 28 years old, broad-shouldered and lean, with brown hair that curled at his collar and hands that were as rough as any cattleman's in the county. He ran 300 acres of good land east of town, where he kept a respectable herd of longhorns and raised quarter horses that were in demand as far away as San Antonio. He was, by every observable standard, a man's man. He had ridden through 2 dust storms, once pulled a calf from a flash flood single-handed, and had never in his life backed down from a fight when one was truly necessary. The men of Caldera Falls had respected him just fine, right up until the moment they discovered the flowers. It had started 2 years before, when Grant found a patch of wild bluebonnets growing along the creek that cut through the south pasture. He had knelt beside them on his way back from checking the fence line, and something in their color, that deep, impossible blue against the raw Texas red of the earth, had stopped him cold. He had stood there for a full minute just looking. Then, almost without deciding to, he had gone back to the ranch house and begun, methodically and deliberately, to expand that patch. He had read every agricultural pamphlet he could find. He had written a letter to a seed catalog in Missouri. He had mixed careful composts and learned which soils held moisture and which drained clean. Within a year, the south pasture along the creek had become something that could only be called a garden, though none of the men in Caldera Falls would have used that word without a sneer attached to it. Word traveled fast in small towns, and when Hank Buford rode past Grant's property line one afternoon and saw the rows of Indian paintbrush, golden poppies, and wild phlox spreading out from the creek bank like a quilt laid over the earth, he had taken the story straight to Pete Mackel's barbershop. By sundown, the joke was circulating freely. Grant Warren, the man who wrestled longhorns, grew flowers like a widow woman tending her window box. The laughter was not vicious, not at first, but it was persistent, the kind that seeps under the skin if you let it. Men tipped their hats to Grant with a half-smile that said they knew something about him now, something soft. The boys who loitered outside the feed store had taken to calling him Daisy, though they were careful to do it just out of earshot. Grant had heard every word of it. He was not deaf, and Caldera Falls was not large. He had taken it without flinching, which was perhaps the most unnerving thing about him. He did not explain himself. He did not apologize. He just kept growing his flowers, kept tending his cattle, kept showing up to town on Saturdays with dust on his boots and quiet in his eyes. When old Pete Mackel had asked him directly one afternoon, with the kind of bluntness only a barber who had known a man since boyhood could manage, Grant had simply said, "They're beautiful, Pete." That's enough reason for anything. Pete had shaken his head and gone back to his razor, and that had been that. The bouquet of columbines he carried into the Silver Creek saloon on that May afternoon in 1878 was intended for Martha, the woman who ran the saloon's small kitchen and had been kind to Grant since he was a boy riding into town behind his father. She had a birthday every May, and for 2 years running, Grant had brought her flowers from his garden. The men at the bar watched him cross the room, watched him hand the purple and gold bouquet to a blushing, delighted Martha, and then watched him settle onto a stool and order a whiskey as if nothing remarkable had happened at all. "Daisy Grant," drawled Cole Hennessy from the end of the bar, not bothering to lower his voice. Cole was 30, loud, and had the particular confidence of a man who had never examined himself too closely. "You fixing to open a flower shop next? Maybe put on a bonnet while you're at it." The men around him chuckled. Grant looked at Cole with the level, unhurried gaze of a man who genuinely could not be bothered to be wounded by stupidity. He picked up his whiskey. "Flowers look better than you do, Cole," he said, and drank. It was not the wittiest thing ever said in a saloon, but the quiet certainty in Grant's voice killed the laughter before it could fully form. Cole reddened, muttered something into his beer, and turned away. Grant finished his drink, nodded to Martha, and walked back out into the May afternoon. He did not know, as he untied his horse and swung into the saddle, that the stagecoach arriving from San Antonio that same afternoon carried a woman who had been told that Caldera Falls was a fresh start, and who was desperate enough to believe it. Susanna Townsend was 26 years old, and she had packed everything she owned into a single leather trunk that now rode in the luggage boot of the stagecoach, bumping along the rutted road toward a town she had never seen. She sat with her hands folded in her lap, watching the landscape change as Texas opened itself up around her, the oak and pecan trees thinning out and the country growing wider, redder, more raw. She wore a practical gray dress that had been washed too many times and a hat that had belonged to her mother. Everything about her traveling clothes said she was a woman who had made sensible decisions with limited resources, but her face told a different story. It was a face of quiet determination, the kind that forms when a person has survived something and decided they will not let it define them. She had survived two things. The first was the death of her father, a bookkeeper in San Antonio who had keeled over his desk 3 years ago and left Susanna with a small house, a moderate debt, and the sudden, clarifying knowledge that she was entirely on her own. The second was a man named Douglas Calloway, who had been charming and ambitious, and whom Susanna had trusted enough to agree to marry, only to discover, 8 months before their planned wedding, that he was already married to a woman in Galveston and had been the entire time she had known him. The discovery had cost her the house, which she had foolishly let him manage, and most of what remained of her father's savings. It had not cost her her dignity, which she kept the way a person keeps a good knife, close and sharp. The job offer in Caldera Falls had come through a teacher's placement agency in San Antonio. The town's single school had been without a teacher for 2 years, following the departure of its previous instructor to the greener pastures of a cattle baron's daughter. The town council had written to the agency, and the agency had presented Susanna's credentials, which were genuine and solid, and Susanna had accepted with the swiftness of someone who understood that fresh starts did not wait around to be deliberated over. She stepped off the stagecoach into a cloud of dust and the indifferent regard of 3 men sitting outside the livery stable. The town was smaller than she had imagined, a single main street with wooden boardwalks, a bank, a general store, a barber shop, a saloon, and a handful of smaller enterprises. Beyond the rooftops, the land stretched away in every direction, flat and enormous and faintly terrifying to a woman who had spent her whole life in a city, however small. A man from the town council, a round-faced fellow named Alderman Briggs, was waiting for her. He pumped her hand with the enthusiasm of someone who had been hoping for a man, but was willing to settle. He showed her to the small 2-room house beside the schoolhouse that would serve as her lodgings, explained that the school term began Monday week, and then invited her to supper at the home of himself and his wife as a welcome. She accepted, and then, when Alderman Briggs had gone, she stood in the doorway of her new house and looked out at the dry Main Street and the enormous sky and felt, very briefly and very privately, afraid. She had been afraid before. She had learned that fear was not a reason to stop. She unpacked her trunk, made the small house as habitable as she could with the limited contents, and told herself, as she had told herself a dozen times since leaving San Antonio, that she was capable of building something good from very little, because she had already done it once. She met Grant Warren the following morning, and she did not know yet that it would matter. He was at the general store when she arrived to set up an account, which was the practical first business of any new resident. He stood at the counter with a written list in his hand, ordering feed supplements in the unhurried way of a man who knew exactly what he needed and had no anxiety about asking for it. Susanna waited behind him, looking at the shelves of goods with the cataloging eye of a woman who was making mental calculations about what she could afford. "Miss," said the store's owner, a spare man named Lucas Fry. Grant stepped aside without being asked, gesturing toward the counter with a brief, natural courtesy that had nothing performative in it. He did not look at her with the extended assessment she had come to expect from men in frontier towns, that slow up and down that measured a woman for available status and personal weakness. He simply moved and waited, and then went back to his list when she had finished. "You're the new schoolteacher," Lucas said, not quite as a question. News traveled fast. "I am," Susanna said. "Susanna Townsend." She was aware of Grant Warren listening, though he did not turn. She gave him no more thought. She gave him somewhat more thought 3 days later when she went to introduce herself to the families of her prospective students and followed her hand-drawn map to a ranch east of town. She had been told the Warren Ranch had children she ought to meet, which turned out to be only half accurate. What the ranch had was Grant's younger sister, Clara, 22 years old and newly arrived herself, who was keeping house for Grant while her own husband finished a construction job in Abilene. Clara had a 3-year-old son named Thomas, who was too young for school but whom Clara was determined Susanna should meet anyway, because Clara was the kind of woman who made friends by sheer cheerful persistence. Clara Warren was warm and talkative and pressed coffee and corn cake on Susanna before she had cleared the doorstep, and it was during this visit that Susanna looked out the kitchen window and saw the garden. It stopped her mid-sentence. From the kitchen window, the south pasture beyond the fence line was visible, and the creek beyond it, and along the creek bank, in the full, unashamed color of late spring Texas, there were flowers. Not a few scattered wildflowers, not an accidental patch of volunteer color. There was a deliberate, tended, abundant sweep of bluebonnets and Indian paintbrush and golden poppies and wild phlox, laid out in a way that suggested both care and a certain freedom of spirit, as if someone had decided where to begin but had then let beauty proceed at its own pace. "Who tends those?" Susanna asked, setting down her coffee cup. Clara followed her gaze and smiled, and there was something layered in that smile, something fond and slightly protective. "Grant has done for 2 years. He started it from a single patch of bluebonnets he found growing wild." She paused. "The men in town find it tremendously amusing." "Do they?" Susanna said, and something moved in her expression that Clara was experienced enough to notice and wise enough not to comment on. Grant came in from the east pasture half an hour later, having no idea Susanna was there. He pulled his hat off at the door, ran a hand through his dusty hair, and then stopped when he saw the woman sitting at his kitchen table with his sister. He looked at Susanna with the direct, unguarded look of a man who had not had time to prepare an expression. "Grant, this is Susanna Townsend," Clara said, with the particular brightness of someone who is very carefully not doing anything. "She is the new schoolteacher. She came to meet the families." "Miss Townsend," Grant said. He crossed to the wash basin and cleaned his hands and then sat at the table and accepted the coffee Clara put in front of him. "How are you finding Caldera Falls?" "Honest," Susanna said. "That is the word I would use so far. It does not pretend to be anything other than what it is." Grant looked at her with something that sharpened slightly, a recalibration of attention. "That is an interesting way to put it." "I mean it as a compliment," she said. "I have lived in places that spent considerable energy pretending to be something they were not. I find the honesty a relief." He held her gaze for a moment. There was nothing inappropriate in it, nothing that pressed. It was the gaze of a man who was genuinely considering what she had said, and Susanna was used enough to men who did not genuinely consider what she said that the contrast registered. She said she had noticed his garden. There was a brief, almost imperceptible bracing in him, not quite a flinch, the ghost of the preparation a person makes when they expect to be laughed at or questioned. Then it dissolved because her tone had not been mocking. "What do you think of it?" he asked, and the directness of the question surprised her, though she did not let it show. "I think it is one of the most genuinely beautiful things I have seen since I arrived," she said. "I grew up with a small garden in San Antonio. My mother kept roses. I have missed that kind of thing." Something settled in Grant Warren's face, a settling she would come to recognize over the following weeks, the particular quiet of a man who had been carrying a small defensive tension and set it down because it was no longer needed. Clara watched all of this with the expression of a woman investing emotionally in a play whose outcome she is very much hoping to influence. Nothing dramatic happened that afternoon. Susanna finished her coffee, thanked Clara for her hospitality, shook Grant's hand at the door, and walked the 2 miles back to Caldera Falls with the sun warming the back of her neck. But she thought about the garden on the walk back, and she thought about the man who grew it in a place where that earned you mockery, and she thought that there was something important in that particular combination, a man who grew beautiful things not for approval or recognition, but because he thought they were worth growing. She had not expected to think about anyone like that for a long time. The first real chance for them to speak at length came the following Saturday, when the town held its monthly gathering on the main street, which served as the social event of the month, part market, part community meeting, part general excuse for people to stand around and talk to each other. Susanna had been told by Clara, who had arrived in town that morning with Thomas on her hip and mischief in her eyes, that these gatherings were not optional if you wanted to be considered a real member of the community. Susanna was not by nature a gatherer of people, but she was practical, and she understood the value of being known and trusted in a place where she intended to put down roots. She put on her second-best dress, the blue wool one that still had good color in it, and went a stand in the warm May morning among the families of Caldera Falls. She was introduced to people she tried hard to remember. She spoke to the mothers of her prospective students, filed away names and domestic situations, and the small details that made each household distinct. She watched the men gather in their own cluster near the feed store, the cluster that included, she noticed, Grant Warren, standing slightly apart from the others with a quietness about him that was not unfriendliness but was its own form of self-containment. She saw the moment it happened. A man she would later learn was Cole Hennessy said something to the group that made several of the men laugh, and though she could not hear the words, she could see the trajectory of the laughter, the way it glanced toward Grant and then away, and she could see the way Grant received it, without moving, without acknowledging, but with a slight tightening around his eyes that spoke of a man who was tired, not angry, just tired. She crossed to where he was standing without entirely deciding to. "Mr. Warren," she said. He turned and the tightening around his eyes dissolved. "Miss Townsend." He looked genuinely pleased, which was not a complicated expression on his face. Some men plastered over their feelings with performance, but Grant Warren's face generally matched his interior, which was either a gift or a vulnerability, and she had not yet decided which. "Are you expected to stand with the men and not the women at these gatherings?" she asked, nodding toward both clusters. "It is expected," he said, "not required." "Then walk with me," she said. "I want to see the rest of the town, and I do not know where everything is." He fell into step beside her without hesitation, and they walked the length of Main Street, and she asked questions about the town, and he answered them with the particular precision of a man who paid attention to things. He told her about the history of Caldera Falls, how it had started as a water stop on the cattle drives north, how it had grown enough to call itself a town, but not enough yet to call itself anything more than that. He told her about the land, about the quality of the soil and the patterns of the rainfall, with the quiet enthusiasm of a person for whom the physical world was a source of genuine interest rather than a problem to be managed. She told him about San Antonio, about growing up in the city, about her father's work, and the particular color of the river on Sunday mornings when the light came through the cypress trees. She did not tell him about Douglas Calloway. Not yet. That story had its own weight and its own timing. They ended up at the far end of the street, where the buildings gave way to open land, and stood looking out at the country to the east. From here, though the Warren Ranch was too far to see, the direction of it was visible, and the sky above that direction was very blue. "Can I ask you something directly, Mr. Warren?" she said. "You can try," he said, which was an answer that already told her something about him, a willingness to be honest without promising he could be completely transparent about everything. "The flowers," she said. "The men here find it amusing. I've heard the comments. Clara told me more. I want to know why you do it anyway. Not what you said to Pete Mackle, which Clara told me about too. I want the full answer." He was quiet for a moment, and she thought he might deflect, but he did not. "My mother kept a garden," he said. "Not the same kind. She did not have the space or the water for what I do. But she had pots on the porch, and she kept them carefully, and the house always smelled of something growing. She died when I was 14. Fever took her in 2 weeks. After she was gone, the pots died too, because nobody remembered to water them." He paused. "That bothered me for a long time. Not just the dying, but the loss of that particular kind of beauty. I think I started the garden to put something of that back in the world. The men can laugh at it if they need to. It's there for me, not for them." Susanna stood very still for a moment. She had been told by experience and by sorrow to be suspicious of men who said beautiful things, because Douglas Calloway had said very beautiful things and had meant none of them. But the way Grant Warren had just spoken was not the speech of a man performing beauty. It was the speech of a man stating a plain fact about himself, with the same directness he might have used to describe the depth of his well or the age of his fence posts. It was beauty without ornament, which was, she thought, the hardest kind to counterfeit. "I am sorry about your mother," she said. "It was 14 years ago," he said. "But thank you." They walked back to the gathering, and she introduced him to nothing in particular, and he introduced her to nobody, and they parted naturally when Clara descended on Susanna to drag her into a conversation with the preacher's wife. But something had been established between them. Some frequency had been set, and neither of them could pretend afterward that they did not know where the other person was in a room. School started the following Monday, and for 2 weeks, Susanna was consumed entirely by the work of establishing a classroom from materials that were inadequate, establishing order among 23 children ranging from 6 to 14, and establishing herself as a person of sufficient authority that the older boys in particular did not test her more than once. She was a good teacher, direct and patient and inventive, and by the end of the 2nd week, the classroom had the particular hum of a place where learning was actually happening. Grant came to see the schoolhouse on a Wednesday afternoon 3 weeks after school started, ostensibly to deliver a written note from Clara about an end-of-week social she was organizing. He arrived when Susanna was alone in the classroom, writing the following day's arithmetic problems on the board. She heard his boots on the step and turned, and he was framed in the doorway with the afternoon light behind him and a sheaf of brown paper in one hand, and she felt a small, inconvenient, entirely expected flutter somewhere in her sternum. "Clara sent a note," he said. "She sent you with it," Susanna said. A brief pause. "She sent me with it." "She is not subtle," Susanna said. "No," Grant agreed, and the corner of his mouth moved in something not quite a smile, but adjacent to one. He handed over the note and did not leave immediately, looking instead at the arithmetic problems on the board with the expression of a man who genuinely found them interesting. He remarked on the method she was using to present the long division problems, having apparently taught himself mathematics through agricultural accounting, and they spent 20 minutes discussing the pedagogical virtues of different approaches to teaching numbers, which was not romantic in the conventional sense, but was the kind of conversation that reveals a great deal about the texture of a person's mind. When he left, Susanna stood at the window and watched him ride away, and told herself firmly that she was a practical woman with a history of bad judgment in this particular area, and she would proceed with appropriate caution. She was at Clara's social on Friday evening, and Grant was there, and they sat at opposite ends of Clara's long kitchen table and managed, despite that distance, to have a conversation that included 3 separate jokes and ran on past the point when everyone else had finished eating. Clara cleared the plates with the expression of a woman who had arranged exactly this and was very pleased with herself. The following Saturday, Grant brought her flowers. He brought them to the schoolhouse on the pretext of dropping off a piece of wood he had promised to the school for the repair of a broken desk bench. He carried the wood in one hand and a small, carefully arranged bunch of yellow prairie coneflowers and blue wild asters in the other. He set both down on the front step and looked at her with the directness that she was already coming to regard as one of the most reliable things about him. "I thought you said you missed having flowers," he said. She took the bouquet and looked at it for a long moment, and the Florida-warm feeling in her chest was something she had not felt in a very long time and was not going to pretend was not there. "Thank you, Grant," she said, and it was the first time she had used his given name, and they were both aware of it. "Susanna," he said, testing it, and she looked up from the flowers, and the space between them was not large and the afternoon was very quiet. Nothing happened in that moment except that they both understood something had shifted. He visited the schoolhouse twice the following week on equally transparent pretexts. Susanna accepted both visits with the composure of a woman who knew what she wanted, but was old enough to be sure before she moved toward it. She had questions about him that she needed answered first, not questions about his character. That was already becoming clear, but questions about where he was in his own life, about what he thought he wanted, about whether he was the kind of man who could hear her whole story without flinching. She found her opening on a Sunday afternoon 2 weeks into June, when Grant invited her to see the garden properly. He had mentioned it casually, in the way he sometimes mentioned things, as a simple fact offered without pressure, and she had said she would like that. And on Sunday after church he collected her from the schoolhouse and they rode together to the ranch. The garden was even more remarkable up close than it had been from the kitchen window. The heat of early June had brought the colors to their peak, and the creek bank was running with the blue and gold and orange and white of a dozen different species that had no business being this lush in the Texas drought country, except that Grant had learned the exact science of making the soil hold water, and had applied it with a patience that bordered on devotion. He knew the name of everything growing there, common and botanical. He knew when each plant bloomed and for how long and what it preferred. He moved through the garden with the same quiet authority he carried everywhere, but with a particular ease, a dropping of whatever small remaining defenses he kept around him in town. Susanna walked beside him and asked questions, and listened to the answers and felt, very strongly, that she was seeing something real about him that most people in Caldera Falls either laughed at or were indifferent to, and that she was not either of those things. She was moved by it, specifically, not by the garden itself, though the garden was genuinely beautiful, but by what the garden represented. This was a man who had decided that beauty mattered, and had acted on that decision at personal cost, consistently and without apology, for years. She had decided before she left the garden that afternoon that she was going to tell him about Douglas Calloway. Not because he was owed the story, but because she needed to tell someone who would understand that it was not simple, and she was not entirely healed from it, and because the kind of future she was allowing herself to begin imagining needed an honest foundation. She told him walking back toward the house, when the horses were visible at the fence, and the late afternoon had turned the light amber and gentle. She told it plainly, without performing either the wound or the recovery from it. She told him Douglas had been charming, and she had trusted him, and he had been lying about everything, and that she had lost most of what she owned because of it, and that she had come to Caldera Falls partly because it was a place where nobody knew her history and she could begin again. Grant listened without interrupting, which was the right thing to do. When she finished, he was quiet for a moment, and then he said, "You told me that because you wanted me to know the full picture." "Yes," she said. "Then I should tell you the full picture of something on my side," he said. He told her about a woman he had planned to marry 3 years before, a woman from a good San Antonio family who had been visiting her uncle's ranch near Caldera Falls for a summer season, and who had been enchanted by the romance of ranch life, and much less enchanted by the reality of it. She had gone back to San Antonio, and he had understood in her departure that she had never really seen him, only a version of him that fit what she was looking for, and that he had been at fault too for letting himself be seen that way rather than being clear about what his actual life was. "I've been particular since then," he said. "Not closed, but particular. I know the difference between someone who sees what they want to see and someone who sees what's actually there." "Which category do I fall into?" she asked, because she was direct and because it was the obvious question. He looked at her with the full, considered, unhurried attention that she had come to regard as one of his most significant qualities. "You looked at the garden before you looked at me," he said, "and you asked about it seriously. Nobody does that. I think that tells me something about how you see things." She rode back to town in the amber evening feeling something she had not felt in 2 years, which was the genuine, tentative, carefully guarded beginning of hope. The town, because it was a small town and therefore noticed everything, began to notice them. Mrs. Alderman Briggs mentioned to her husband that she had seen Grant Warren stopping at the schoolhouse, rather more often than wood delivery required. Pete Mackle observed to the men in his barber shop that the new schoolteacher seemed to find the flower-growing rancher worth visiting on Sunday afternoons. Cole Hennessy made a remark at the Silver Creek Saloon that connected Grant's flowers with the schoolteacher in a way that was designed to be funny and managed instead to be just unpleasant enough that the man next to Cole, who was not a friend of Grant's particularly but had a sister and therefore certain standards, told Cole to watch his mouth. None of this reached Susanna directly. Most of it reached Grant, who received it with his customary quiet. What it did was make him thoughtful about the pace at which things were developing, not because he wanted to slow it, but because he was aware that her reputation in a new town was more fragile than his, and he did not want his interest in her to be the thing that made her first months in Caldera Falls complicated. He told her this directly, in the schoolhouse on a Tuesday afternoon, because that was how he handled things that needed handling. "I don't want the town's gossip to make your position here harder," he said. "I want to be clear about my intentions, but I also want it done in a way that protects you rather than exposes you." She looked at him for a long moment with the particular expression she wore when she was deciding something. "What are your intentions?" she asked. It was the direct question, the one that would have made most men circle and hedge. Grant looked at her with his level, honest gaze and said, "I intend to court you properly if you're willing to be courted, and I intend to do it the right way, which I know you need after what you've been through." Susanna felt the warmth of that move through her in a way that was steady and deep rather than flashy. There was no performance in what he had said, no strategy. It was a plain declaration of honest purpose, and she valued plain declarations of honest purpose more than almost anything else in the world. "Then court me properly, Grant Warren," she said, "and I will let myself be courted." He took his hat off slightly, which was the frontier version of a bow, and she laughed, and it was the first full, unguarded laugh he had heard from her, and it did something significant to his chest. The proper courtship of Susanna Townsend by Grant Warren was conducted over the following weeks with a seriousness that would have been excessive if it had been stiff, but it was not stiff. It was sincere. Grant asked Alderman Briggs formally if he might call on Miss Townsend, because that was the correct form, and Alderman Briggs said yes with a speed that suggested he had been waiting to be asked. Grant's sister Clara, when she received this news, produced a sound of satisfaction that could have been heard in the next county. He called on her Sunday afternoons when the week's work was done. They rode out along the creek, or sat on Clara's porch drinking coffee while Thomas ran in the yard, or walked the length of Main Street at the civilized hour of early evening when the dust had settled and the town was quiet. They talked about everything. They talked about books, because they had both read more than their respective situations were assumed to allow for. They talked about what they each wanted their lives to look like in 10 years, with the careful but genuine directness of two people who understood that 10 years was not a metaphor. They talked about the school and the ranch and the particular challenges of each, and Grant listened to her difficulties with the same engaged attention he gave everything, and she listened to his with the same, and they each felt, distinctly, the pleasure of being listened to by someone who was actually hearing. On an evening in July, Grant showed her something he had not shown anyone except Clara. At the far end of the garden, near the point where the creek curved south, he had planted a small square of Castilian roses, ordered at tremendous expense from a catalog in New Orleans, and nursed through 2 Texas summers with a devotion that bordered on the miraculous. There were 7 plants, and 2 of them were blooming, and the blooms were a pink so deep it was nearly red, and the scent in the warm evening air was something Susanna felt in the back of her throat like a physical thing. "My mother's name was Rose," Grant said. He said it quietly, not to be affecting, just stating the fact that explained the roses. Susanna reached out without thinking and took his hand. He went very still for a moment, and then he turned his hand and held hers, and they stood in the fading July light beside his mother's roses and did not need to say anything more. When he walked her back to the schoolhouse that evening, he stopped at the step and looked at her with an expression that had moved past careful into something more open. "I think I should tell you," he said, "that I am not a man who has said things he did not mean as a general rule. So when I say that I have not felt this way about anyone in a very long time, I want you to take that seriously rather than as a courtship formality." "I take it seriously," she said. "Good," he said. Then, after a beat, "Because I think I am already more than halfway in love with you, Susanna, and I thought you should know." She stood on the step, which put them at eye level, and the space between their faces was smaller than it had been before, and she thought about Douglas Calloway and his beautiful words, and then thought that this was nothing like that, not in tone and not in texture, and that she trusted this with her whole clear mind, not just with the hopeful and unreliable part. "I think I am already more than halfway in love with you too," she said. He kissed her then, gently and with complete intention, a kiss that meant what it said, and she kissed him back, and the evening was warm and the stars were beginning above Caldera Falls, and the roses at the end of the garden were still releasing their scent into the dark. The town's response to the announced courtship was, broadly, approving. The women of Caldera Falls were happy for Susanna in the warm and slightly proprietary way of people who have felt themselves partly responsible for a newcomer's happiness. The men were, most of them, genuinely glad for Grant, even those who still occasionally made the daisy joke, because they knew Grant Warren was a good man, and a good man deserved a good woman. Pete Mackle told Grant in the barber shop that the new teacher was the smartest woman to come through Caldera Falls since Mrs. Judge Haverford, and that was the highest compliment Pete had in his vocabulary. Cole Hennessy made one more remark. It was in the saloon on a Saturday night, something about flowers being the right bait for a schoolteacher, and it was said with the particular sourness of a man who resents other people's happiness. Grant was not there to hear it, but his ranch hand Jimmy was, and Jimmy went home and told his wife, and his wife told Clara, and Clara told Grant on Sunday morning before he went to call on Susanna. Grant said, "Is Susanna unhappy about it?" Clara said, "She doesn't know." "Then it doesn't matter," Grant said and went to collect his horse. but it did slightly matter, and not because of the insult itself. It mattered because Susanna had spent 2 years being made a fool of by a man who had hidden his real nature behind charming surfaces. And the town's gossip about Grant's flowers was a persistent small note in the wrong key. She had heard some of it by now, the daisy remarks, the jokes about the bouquet he took to Martha at the saloon. She had developed an opinion about it. She delivered that opinion at the next Saturday gathering, in front of enough people that it counted. She was standing near the feed store with a group of women when Cole Hennessy passed and made a comment that was directed at Grant across the street, something about how maybe he should rename the ranch the Flower Bed. The men nearby laughed. Susanna turned and looked at Cole Hennessy with a quality of regard that was neither angry nor cold, but was completely clear. "Mr. Hennessy," she said, in the voice she used in the classroom when she was about to make a point that would not be argued with. "I have been in this town 2 months, and I have met 20-odd men, and Grant Warren is the only one who has done anything that took real courage. It takes no courage at all to tend cattle the way every other man in the county tends cattle. It takes quite a lot of courage to grow something beautiful in a place where you know you will be laughed at for it. I have been looking for exactly that kind of man for a long time, and I am glad I found him." The silence after she said it was not uncomfortable. It was the silence of people recalibrating. Cole Hennessy looked at her for a moment, and then he looked at the ground, and then he muttered something and walked away. Several of the men near him were wearing expressions that suggested Susanna had said something they already knew, in a way that made them hear it properly for the first time. Grant, who had been across the street and had heard every word, stood very still for a moment, and then he crossed the street and came to stand beside her, and she looked up at him with the clear, calm face of a woman who had said what she meant and had no regrets about it. "You didn't have to do that," he said. "I know," she said. "I wanted to." He looked at her for a long moment with something in his face that was past halfway now, well past halfway, heading toward the full and complete version of itself, and it was visible enough that the women around them developed sudden pressing business in other directions to allow them a semblance of privacy. "Susanna Townsend," he said, "I believe you might be the finest person I have ever known." "That is a very high bar," she said. "I set high bars," he said. The summer moved forward in the way of Texas summers, hot and enormous and relentless, and Susanna and Grant moved deeper into the particular country of each other's character, mapping it with the care of two people who had both been hurt and knew, therefore, what was worth being careful with. School let out in July for the harvest season, when the older children were needed on the farms. Susanna used the break to help Clara with the household, which was not required of her but which she offered because she genuinely liked Clara, and because the Warren Ranch house had begun to feel like a place she could be comfortable. She learned the ranch's rhythms, the early mornings, the long working days, the evening quiet when the heat broke and the land made its own sounds. She helped Grant's ranch hand Jimmy's wife with the canning, and she sat with Clara on the porch on the long evenings, and she watched Grant come in from the day's work with dust and honest tiredness on him, and she felt something she could only call rightness, the sense that this particular life, this specific place and these specific people were meant to be hers. She was in the garden one afternoon in late July, sketching the flowers in a journal she kept, when Grant came and sat on the creek bank nearby and watched her draw. She was not a trained artist, but she drew with attention, and her sketches captured the specific nature of each plant rather than a generic idea of flowers. "What are you going to do with those?" he asked. "I thought I might use them for science lessons," she said. "Botany. Show the children that the plants around them are worth studying." He was quiet for a moment, and she could feel him thinking. "I could teach them with you," he said. "Bring them here. Show them what I know about growing things in this soil." The practical side. She looked up from her journal. "You would let 23 children loose in your garden. 18. The older 5 would be working their family farms." "Still, they are children," he said simply. "They ought to know how to make things grow." She looked at him with a tenderness she did not try to contain, and he received it without deflecting. "Yes," she said, "I think that would be exactly the right thing to do." He proposed to her in August, on an evening when the heat had finally broken after 3 weeks of oppressive stillness, and the air smelled of distant rain, and the roses at the end of the garden were putting out a second, smaller bloom. He did it without theater, which was appropriate, because theater was not his nature. He simply stopped on the path between the roses and the creek, and took both her hands and said that he loved her, and that he intended to love her for the rest of his life, and wanted to know if she would allow him to do it properly, which meant marrying him. Susanna stood with both her hands in his and the rose-scented air around them, and thought of everything that had happened in the past 2 years of her life. The losses and the rebuilding and the long, careful journey to a small Texas town where a man grew flowers and meant it. And she thought that she had been right, that day in Clara's kitchen when she first saw the garden, that this meant something important. "Yes," she said. "Grant Warren, yes." He held her face in both hands and kissed her with a completeness that said everything he had not yet found words for, and the first drops of the long-awaited rain began to fall, and they stood in it and did not move, because neither of them was willing to break the moment for something as ordinary as getting out of the rain. They were both thoroughly soaked by the time they made it to the porch, and Clara, who was watching from the kitchen window, took one look at their faces and made a sound like a small explosion of triumph. "Finally," she said, and handed them both towels. The wedding was in September, a Saturday morning in the open field beside the church, because the church itself was too small for the number of people who decided they needed to attend. Susanna wore a dress of cream-colored lawn that Clara had helped her make over the 2 weeks prior, with a collar of lace that had belonged to Clara and Grant's mother, and which Clara had offered with a significance that Susanna had understood fully. Grant wore his best dark coat and had his hair cut by Pete Mackle, who did it with the solemn attention of a man creating a historical artifact. The ceremony was performed by Reverend Hadley, who was a thin, earnest man with a gift for the kind of plain-spoken sincerity that the frontier required of its religion. He spoke about the particular courage of love in hard country, about the choice to build beauty in a place that did not make it easy, and he said this in a way that everyone present understood was both metaphorical and specific, a reference to the garden that everyone in Caldera Falls now knew about, and which had been, it was generally agreed in retrospect, entirely admirable from the beginning. When Grant slid the ring onto Susanna's finger and she looked up at him, she was not performing any of the requisite emotions. She was simply feeling them, the love and the gladness and the deep, structural security of knowing that this man was honest and tender and stubborn about beauty, and that she was exactly the right person to be loved by exactly this man. When Reverend Hadley announced they were married, Clara burst into open tears. Thomas tried to eat a handful of the grass he was sitting in, and old Pete Mackle blew his nose loudly into a handkerchief. And even Cole Hennessy, who was at the back of the gathered crowd and had come partly out of genuine goodwill and partly out of the social pressure of not being conspicuously absent, found something in his eyes that required attention. The reception was held in the field and then moved to Clara's extended yard as the afternoon progressed, with food contributed by half the women of the town and music provided by 3 men with a fiddle, a guitar, and an ambition somewhat larger than their technical ability, but joyful for all that. Susanna danced with Grant in the long September afternoon and felt, with the kind of certainty that does not require repetition, that she had come to the right place. Jimmy, Grant's ranch hand, who was a quiet man of 30 with a wife named Pearl and 2 small children, told Grant during a moment between songs that he was glad for him, and that the ranch had been needing a schoolteacher in it for some time. Grant laughed, which was not something he did easily but did often enough around the right people, and clapped Jimmy on the shoulder and said he thought so too. By nightfall the gathering had wound itself down, the families had gone home, Clara had taken Thomas to bed, and Grant and Susanna were alone in the ranch house for the first time, which was the new ranch house. His house, their house, and the particular quality of that ownership, both of them in it together, was something both of them felt in a way that exceeded the merely ceremonial. The first year of their marriage was not without difficulty, because marriage in the frontier west of 1878 did not allow for the purely romantic version of itself. The fall brought a drought that cut the water in the creek by half, and Grant spent 3 weeks with Jimmy and 2 hired hands digging a secondary channel to redirect what water there was toward the most critical parts of the garden and the cattle pasture. Susanna spent those 3 weeks managing the school, managing the household, and spending every available hour during the dry heat helping Grant in the garden, learning faster than he had expected what kept the plants alive when the water was short. The drought broke in November with the kind of violent, excessive generosity that Texas sometimes produced. 3 inches of rain in 48 hours that flooded the creek and undid a week of fence repairs, and caused a cow to get stuck in a boggy section of the south pasture, and require the combined effort of Grant, Jimmy, and Susanna, who had never pulled a cow out of mud before but approached the task with her customary practicality and a dry sense of humor that Grant found. In the middle of a frustrating and physically exhausting operation, genuinely sustaining, they settled into the life of the ranch with the particular pleasure of 2 people who had each been a little lonely and now were not. Grant's reserve softened further in the daily proximity of Susanna's warmth and directness, and Susanna's habitual self-sufficiency relaxed enough to allow her to receive care as well as give it, which was a thing she had struggled with before. In the evenings they sat together, sometimes reading, sometimes talking, sometimes just present in the same room with the fire going and the sounds of the ranch outside, and both of them felt in those evenings something that could reasonably be called contentment. Clara's husband Samuel arrived from Abilene in December, a broad-shouldered, quiet man who shook Grant's hand with the warmth of a man who considered Grant family, and who regarded Susanna with immediate approval. They moved into a house on the north side of town, and while this removed Clara from the daily life of the ranch, it did not remove her from Susanna's life, because Clara and Susanna had by this point established the kind of friendship that requires geography only as a minor inconvenience. In the spring of 1879, when the garden came back to life with a fullness that was partly natural exuberance and partly 2 people's accumulated attention, Susanna discovered she was pregnant. She told Grant on a Sunday morning in March, on the creek bank where the bluebonnets were beginning to show their first color of the year, because it seemed the right place for the information. He went very still in the way he had that first time she had taken his hand, a stillness of someone receiving something large and needing a moment to hold it properly. Then he pulled her into his arms and held her with a tenderness that was different from all the previous forms of his tenderness, layered now with something new, something that was looking forward rather than present, already reaching toward a future that had just become more specific. "Are you well?" he asked, against her hair. "I am very well," she said. "Good," he said, and then, after a moment, with a quiet joy that was entirely his own, "Good." He was, throughout the pregnancy, attentive without being managing, concerned without being anxious, helpful in the practical ways that made a difference rather than the performative ways that created more work. He brought Susanna tea in the mornings when the first trimester made her slow and queasy, and he modified the household routine to remove the physical tasks that were becoming difficult, and he read to her in the evenings from the agricultural pamphlets and the books she borrowed from the small collection at the schoolhouse, because she liked to hear his voice in the quiet. Clara visited every week, and the 2 women's friendship deepened in the particular way of women who are navigating adjacent stages of life and can compare notes with honest affection. Clara's Thomas was 4 now, bold and curious and entirely charmed by Susanna's willingness to answer questions at full length rather than in the simplified versions adults often offered children. The baby came in October, a Tuesday morning with the weather turned and the first cold air of the season coming down from the north. It was a boy, born healthy and loud, with Grant's brown hair and Susanna's particular expression of focused determination. They named him William for Susanna's father, whose name had been William Townsend, and who Susanna wished with a steady, low grief could have seen this. Grant held his son for the first time in the afternoon, sitting in the chair by the bedroom window with the cold October light coming in, and his face had an expression that Susanna, watching from the bed, found difficult to look at directly because it was so entirely unguarded. Grant Warren, who was careful and quiet and who held himself with a certain reserve even in intimacy, was holding his son with the completely open face of a man experiencing joy that exceeded his capacity for self-containment, and it was one of the most beautiful things she had ever seen. "Hello, William," he said, very quietly, to the bundle in his arms. William, who had been looking at the ceiling with the unfocused gravity of a newborn considering the nature of existence, did not respond. "He will get more conversational," Susanna said. "I can wait," Grant said, still looking at his son. That winter was the warmest winter Caldera Falls had seen in 6 years, and the ranch moved through it in good order. Jimmy and Pearl and their children became a second family, sharing Sunday dinners and the work of the place with the comfortable intimacy of people whose lives were genuinely intertwined. Grant expanded the cattle herd in the spring, having secured a favorable arrangement with a buyer in San Antonio who wanted a regular supply of good beef and was willing to pay market price for quality. The ranch was prospering, not extravagantly, but solidly, in the way that made the future feel less like a risk and more like a construction project. The garden expanded too. In the spring of 1880, the year William took his first steps along the creek bank with his father's hand steadying him, Grant added a new section to the north side of the garden, planting Texas mountain laurel and desert marigold, and a row of climbing roses along the fence that Clara had given them as a cutting from a parent plant in her own yard. The garden had become, over 4 years, something genuinely extraordinary in the context of a working cattle ranch, a thing of color and scent, and a certain defiant loveliness that said, clearly and without apology, that the man who owned this land thought beauty was worth the trouble. People had stopped laughing about it mostly. Some of the men still made the occasional remark, because old habits in small towns have the persistence of mesquite roots, but the remarks had lost their edge. Partly this was because Grant had been prospering, and prosperity was its own argument in frontier Texas. Partly it was because Susanna had said, at that Saturday gathering 2 years back, what she had said, and it had shifted something in the town's collective understanding. And partly it was because time and familiarity had done their work, and the garden was now just something the Warren Ranch had, like good horses and well-mended fences, a mark of the particular character of the people who lived there. Cole Hennessy, for his part, had made his peace. He had come to Grant's wedding. He had nodded to Susanna at subsequent gatherings, and he had, one afternoon in the spring of 1880, stopped at the fence while riding past and looked at the garden for a long moment, and then turned to Grant, who was nearby mending a section of rail, and said, "It does look good, Warren." It was not an apology and it was not a speech, but it was something, and Grant accepted it as something and said, "Thank you, Hennessy." And that was the end of a 4-year conversation that had been neither deep nor important but had needed finishing. William grew. He was a bright, energetic child with his father's quietness interrupted by his mother's precision of expression, a combination that manifested as a child who observed everything, and then said, at intervals, things that were entirely true and occasionally inconvenient. He walked early, talked early, and had by the age of 2 developed a passionate attachment to the garden that Grant regarded with a joy so deep it was almost solemn. By the summer of 1881, Susanna was pregnant again. This time she told Grant in the garden in the evening near the roses he had planted for his mother, and he responded the same way he had the first time, with that still, receiving quality, and then with his arms around her, his face in her hair. "Two of them," he said. "Two," she agreed. "The house is big enough," he said practically, because he was still Grant Warren. "The house is big enough," she confirmed. The second child was a girl, born in February of 1882 on a night when the stars were extraordinary, which Susanna noted in the journal she kept, and which Grant, showing his daughter the garden for the first time on a spring morning 3 months later, mentioned to the small, entirely uncomprehending bundle in his arms as a relevant fact about her first night in the world. They named her Rose, for the woman they had never met but whose garden had given them their beginning. Rose Warren grew up knowing the garden from the beginning. By the time she was 2, she could name the flowers her father showed her, imperfectly but enthusiastically, and Grant taught her with the same patient precision he taught everything, kneeling in the garden dirt with his daughter beside him in the way he had once knelt beside the first wild bluebonnets, and found something worth attending to. William, who was 2.5 when Rose was born, went through the mandatory period of finding his sister an imposition on his arrangements, and then emerged from it into the particular fierce affection of an older sibling who has decided the newcomer is actually worthwhile. He showed Rose the garden as he understood it, which was to say he showed her the best places to catch the small frogs that lived near the creek and the good mud near the north bank, which was not precisely botanical education, but was its own form of acquaintance with the living world. The school had grown by 1882, enough that Susanna had been given an assistant, a young woman named Alice who had finished school in Dallas and come west with her family and had enough education and enthusiasm to be useful. Susanna and Alice between them managed 29 students by that fall, and the schoolhouse had been expanded by a single room, which Susanna had lobbied for to the town council with the same precise and relentless practicality she applied to all things requiring persuasion. The town council had funded the expansion partly because Susanna Townsend Warren was not a woman you told no without having an excellent reason, and partly because the school was doing measurably good work, and the parents of 29 students made a formidable constituency. On an October afternoon in 1882, 4 years after she had first arrived in Caldera Falls, Susanna stood at the window of the expanded schoolhouse and watched the children file out at the end of the day. She could see, beyond the rooftops of Main Street, the shape of the land to the east, the direction of the ranch, though the ranch itself was too far. She had a meeting with Clara in an hour, and tonight Grant was bringing the children into town to meet her for supper at the hotel, which they did once a month as a family outing, Thomas and William and little Rose at the same table, while the adults tried to have a conversation above and around the excellent intentions and physical activity of 3 children under the age of 6. She was thinking, as she watched the last child disappear around the corner, about how much had changed in 4 years. She had arrived with a single trunk, and a determination born of necessity and a private, carefully guarded hope that she had not let herself examine too directly. She had a house now, a real one, with a garden that people came from neighboring counties to see in the spring. She had a husband who grew flowers in a place that mocked him for it, and who meant every word he said, and had never once given her cause to doubt him. She had 2 children whose particular combination of their parents' qualities suggested futures she could already begin to imagine. She had a school that was doing real work, and a friendship with Clara that she knew would last her life, and neighbors who knew her name and meant it warmly, and a community that was hers in the way that a place only becomes yours after you have put something real into it. She had been looking for exactly that kind of man, though she had not known it in those terms until she saw his garden. She had been looking for someone for whom beauty was a serious thing, a thing worth the trouble, a thing you maintained not because the world rewarded you for it, but because you believed in it. She had found him in the most unlikely location available, a cattle ranch in the dry Texas country where men measured each other in longhorns and shooting accuracy. And he had been growing roses for his dead mother and wildflowers for the pure satisfaction of their color, and taking the town's laughter without flinching. She had recognized him immediately for what he was, which was the rarest kind of person, the kind who knew what they valued and valued it consistently regardless of what it cost them, and who did not perform that knowledge but simply lived it. You could not fake that. She had met a man who faked it, and she knew the texture of the counterfeit, and this was nothing like it. Grant was waiting with the children when she locked the schoolhouse, William tearing around his father's legs with the energy of a 5-year-old who had been sitting still for too many hours, and Rose in Grant's arms with her head on his shoulder, already drowsy in the early evening cool. Grant caught Susanna's eye across the small distance of the street and gave her the particular look he had developed over 4 years of marriage, the one that said, simply, that he was glad she was there. She crossed to him and kissed him and took Rose, and they walked toward the hotel with William between them, holding a hand of each parent and swinging between them with the complete physical trust of a child who has never had reason to doubt the reliability of the ground beneath his feet. Supper at the hotel was everything a supper at the hotel with 2 small children was, which is to say, it was noisy and occasionally chaotic, and required the kind of strategic management of food and attention that made real conversation occur only in fragments between the more pressing issues of who had spilled what and whether William could have more bread, and what exactly Rose had found on the floor that she was now examining with scientific intensity. But in the fragments, there was conversation, real conversation, the kind that only happens between people who know each other well enough to pick up a thread and leave it and pick it up again. And Grant told Susanna about the arrangement he had been discussing with a rancher named Orton in Abilene about a horse breeding program that could supplement the cattle income significantly. And Susanna told Grant about the letter she had received from the school board in Austin expressing interest in the teaching methods she had been developing. And they talked about these things in the easy, interested way of 2 people whose lives were genuinely intertwined at every level, professional and personal and daily and long-term. After supper, walking back through the October night to collect the horses and ride home, Grant held Rose in one arm and took Susanna's hand with the other, and William walked ahead on the boardwalk with the exaggerated care of a child who has been told not to run and is finding the constraint challenging. The stars were out, the same stars that had been out the night Rose was born, though she was too young to know that, and the air smelled of cool dust and wood smoke and the distant possibility of winter. "I heard something in town today," Grant said, in the tone he used when he had been considering whether to mention something. "What did you hear?" asked. "Orton says there is good agricultural land available about 10 miles north of Caldera Falls where a man named Bradley has decided to go back east. Good soil, reliable water from an underground spring, better conditions than the south pasture for certain kinds of plants." She looked at him sideways. "You are thinking about expanding the garden." "I am thinking about a lot of things," he said. "But yes, among them." She squeezed his hand. "Tell me what all the things are," he told her. He had been thinking about the possibility of a commercial component to the garden, not instead of the cattle, but alongside it. There was a market in San Antonio for cut flowers and dried botanical specimens and seeds of native Texas plants, a market that had been growing as the city grew, and its wealthier citizens developed the same appetite for ornamental horticulture that had been spreading east from California for a decade. He had been corresponding, quietly and carefully, with a man in San Antonio who supplied this market, and who had expressed serious interest in a reliable Texas source for native specimens. He said all of this with the particular hesitation of a man proposing something that was important to him and therefore vulnerable, and Susanna listened to every word with the full attention she brought to the things that mattered. When he finished, she said, "Grant Warren, you have been keeping this plan to yourself for how long?" "4 months," he said, with the faint trace of the expression that was his version of sheepish. "4 months," she said, "and you could have told me any time in those 4 months." "I wanted to make sure it was a real plan before I said it out loud," he said. "It is a real plan," she said. "It is a very good plan. I want you to write to the man in San Antonio this week." He looked at her, and in the darkness of the Caldera Falls main street, with William negotiating the end of the boardwalk step ahead of them and Rose's warm weight in his other arm, his face had the quality of a man who was, in the most complete sense, happy. Not excited, not temporarily elated, but happy in the structural sense, in the way that means the fundamental arrangements of your life are right. "I'll write tomorrow," he said. "Good," she said. The letter was sent. The correspondence continued. And by the spring of 1883, Grant Warren had established a working agreement with the San Antonio botanical supplier that provided the ranch with a secondary income stream that was modest at first but grew steadily as the supplier's clients expanded. The expanded garden began that same spring, with a new section along the creek bank that was dedicated to the species in highest demand, and Grant taught himself the additional botanical science required with the same methodical passion he had brought to everything from cattle management to rose cultivation. The men of Caldera Falls received this new development with a range of responses. Some found it funny, as they always had. Some found it admirable, and said so with the quiet directness that men use when they have decided to be honest rather than comfortable. Pete Mackle told Grant it was the cleverest thing he had heard of since someone started charging for ice, which was the highest commercial compliment Pete had. Jimmy, who had been with Grant for 6 years by this point and knew the ranch as well as anyone alive, told Grant he wanted to learn the botanical side, because his wife Pearl had started helping with the garden during the seasons when the cattle work was lighter, and had developed her own serious knowledge of the plants. They were, Grant realized, the beginning of a staff, a small one but real, and the garden had become in truth what it had always been in his own understanding, a legitimate enterprise as worthy of professional attention as any other. Susanna watched all of this with the satisfaction of a woman who had bet correctly on something important. She had said at the Saturday gathering 4 years ago that she had been looking for exactly that kind of man, and she had meant it, and the 4 subsequent years had done nothing but demonstrate how right she had been. Grant was not a man without flaws. He was sometimes too private, held concerns inside longer than was useful, and had to be asked directly before he would acknowledge when something was troubling him. He had a stubbornness that was usually a virtue and occasionally an inconvenience. He was not always easy to read, though she had learned him well enough that she could usually find the meaning behind the quiet. But he was consistent, and his consistency was built on a foundation of genuine values rather than social performance, which was the thing she had most needed to find after Douglas Calloway, who had been all performance and no foundation. Grant grew flowers because he believed they were worth growing, and he loved Susanna with the same quality of conviction, not because loving her was easy or rewarded him socially or confirmed his own image of himself, but because he had looked at her clearly and found her worth the full investment of his heart, and that was what he had given her, consistently, every day of their marriage, and she gave it back the same way. And between them they had built something as solid and as deliberately tended as the garden along the creek. In the summer of 1883, Susanna discovered she was pregnant for the 3rd time. She told Grant in the garden near the roses as she had the 2nd time, because she had decided this was their particular location for important news, and she liked the idea of their family's milestones having a place, somewhere that was beautiful and permanent and theirs. Grant held her for a long time before he said anything. When he did speak, he said, "The house will need another room." "It will," she agreed. "I'll start the foundation before fall," he said. "Of course you will," she said, and she was smiling against his shoulder, and the roses were in their 2nd summer bloom, and the creek made its small sound nearby, and the garden was alive around them with everything they had planted and tended and believed in. And above them the Texas sky was so deeply blue it looked painted, as it always had, the sky of a country that was vast and difficult and completely, enduringly beautiful. The third child was born in early 1884, a boy they named Thomas James Warren, James for Grant's father, who had died the previous year in the house of a friend in Dallas, and whose death had been a quiet grief for Grant that Susanna had sat with him through in the way she did everything significant, present and unhurried and willing to stay as long as it took. Thomas James was from his first days a different character from his siblings, loud where William was quiet, immediately social where Rose was initially reserved, a child who seemed to have come into the world with strong opinions about it and an intention of expressing them. Grant held him at the window on the first morning, as he had held all his children, and looked at him with the same complete, unguarded joy, and said hello to him in the same quiet voice, and Thomas James looked at his father with the particular skepticism of a newborn and then fell asleep. "He'll warm up to you," Susanna said, from the bed. "I can wait," Grant said, and the echo of the thing he had said to William 5 years before was deliberate and recognized, and Susanna felt the warmth of that recognition move through her, the pleasure of the continuity, the sense that they were building something that had its own history now, its own recurring moments, its own language. By the spring of 1885, the Warren Ranch was a place of genuine distinction in the region. The cattle operation was solid and profitable. The horse breeding program had exceeded Grant's initial projections and was supplying quality quarter horses to buyers from San Antonio to El Paso. The botanical garden along the creek had been written about, briefly and approvingly, in an agricultural journal published in Austin, which had caused Alderman Briggs to frame the relevant page and hang it in the council office as evidence of Caldera Falls' cultural vitality. The schoolhouse had been expanded again, and Susanna had 2 assistants now, Alice and a young man named Martin who had come from a teaching college in Houston, and who regarded Susanna with the respectful awe appropriate to someone who had built a frontier school into something genuinely good with inadequate resources and pure determination. She had 38 students by that spring, children from farms and ranches spread across a wide area, some of them riding considerable distances to attend, because word had spread that Miss Townsend Warren's school was worth the travel. William was 8 and already showing the precise, systematic intelligence of a child who would be, in some form or another, an educator or a scientist, possibly both. Rose was 3, and had achieved the remarkable distinction of knowing, by name, every plant in the garden. Thomas James was 1, fully mobile and fully committed to the project of exploring every surface of the house, which required a vigilance that kept both parents and the older children continuously occupied. The town of Caldera Falls had grown, as all frontier towns either grew or died, and the growth had brought new families and new tensions and new opportunities. The railroad had come within 12 miles to the east, which changed everything about the economics of the cattle trade and made the botanical supply business to San Antonio significantly more efficient. The town was beginning to look, in small ways, like a town with a future rather than just a present. On an evening in May of 1885, exactly 7 years after Susanna Townsend had stepped off a stagecoach into the dust of Caldera Falls, she and Grant sat on the porch of the ranch house in the late light and watched the children, those 2 of the 3 who were old enough to be outside under their own direction, moving through the garden in the golden hour. William was at the creek bank, doing something with a stick and a piece of string and a small jar that suggested either a scientific experiment or an attempt to catch something. Rose was in the roses, the climbing roses on the fence now in their 4th summer, thick with pink blooms, moving between them with a seriousness that suggested she was conducting an inspection. Thomas James was between them on the porch, sitting in his father's lap with the calm of a child who had been fed and was now settling toward sleep, his eyes still open and tracking the early stars appearing above the garden. The evening smelled of roses and the warm earth and the particular combination of scents that was the garden in its peak, that smell that Susanna had first encountered coming in through a kitchen window on an afternoon 7 years ago, and had never stopped being grateful for. "Are you happy?" Grant asked. He asked this occasionally, directly, in the way he approached everything important, as a real question requiring a real answer rather than a social nicety. She looked at the garden and the children in it and the sky above the Texas country that had become her home, and she looked at Grant, who had Thomas James against his chest and his boots on the porch rail, and the ease about him of a man who was where he was supposed to be. "I am profoundly happy," she said. "Are you?" He looked at her with the level, complete, honest gaze that had been one of the first things she had noticed about him and had never stopped valuing. "I have a ranch I'm proud of, children I would walk through fire for, a garden that people come from counties away to see, and you," he said. "Yes, Susanna, I am profoundly happy." She leaned against him, careful not to disturb Thomas James, who was at the precipice of sleep and needed only the continuation of the quiet to go over it. Grant put his free arm around her, and they sat in the gathering warm dark of the Texas evening. And below the porch the garden was coming into its night scents, the roses releasing the perfume they saved for the cool hours, and along the creek the frogs were beginning their chorus. Across the years and all the ordinary and extraordinary days that had made them, she thought of the first sight of the garden from that kitchen window, and the man who had built it, and the particular quality of courage that the building of it had taken, and she thought that she had said, standing in front of half the town of Caldera Falls, that she had been looking for exactly that kind of man, and it had been the most accurate thing she had ever said. The kind of man who grew flowers not for approval but because he believed they were worth growing. The kind of man who was what he was without apology and without performance. The kind of man who, when he loved you with the same quality of consistent, undefended intention that he gave to everything he genuinely valued. William called from the creek, something about a frog of particular magnificence that required witnesses. Rose abandoned her inspection of the roses and ran toward the creek to assess the claim. Thomas James opened his eyes briefly at the sound of his siblings' voices, determined the situation did not require his involvement, and closed them again. Grant laughed quietly against Susanna's hair. She felt it move through her, that laugh, and she thought that there was nothing in the world she would have changed. Not the losses that had brought her to Caldera Falls, not the long, careful approach to trusting again, not the drought and the mud and the nights when the baby would not sleep, and the ranch had a problem and the school had a problem, and the Texas sky seemed determined to test the limits of what two people could manage. Not any of it, because all of it had brought her here to this porch, in this evening, in this particular and irreplaceable life. The roses bloomed. The children's voices carried on the night air. Grant held her and his son and did not need to say anything more, because everything real had already been said, years ago and yesterday and in every quiet moment between, and would be said again tomorrow and the day after, in all the small and large ways that two people who have built something true together keep building it every day, as long as they live. The stars came out over Caldera Falls, the same stars they always had, enormous and indifferent, and also, when you looked at them from the right place with the right person, unutterably beautiful. The way the Texas country itself was beautiful. The way the flowers along the creek bank were beautiful. Not in spite of the difficulty, but somehow because of it. Because beauty that has been tended against resistance has a quality of intention in it. A statement of what a person believes is worth the trouble. And Grant Warren had believed it before anyone thought well of him for believing it. And Susanna Townsend had recognized that belief for what it was the moment she first saw its evidence, and between them they had made over 7 years of dry seasons and good ones, a life that was exactly what each of them had been, in their different ways, hoping for. It was enough. It was, in fact, everything.